Today's going to be the last video in my series on unstated gospel symbolism, and I'm calling this a fudge factor or fudge factors. I'll probably look for a image of fudge for the thumbnail. I've been talking about how people who advocate theories of gospel symbolism, often without realizing they're doing so, make it too easy to claim that such unstated symbolism is present, so that it gets claimed without sufficient evidence. And I myself tend to doubt the presence of any unstated, unhinted at gospel symbolism in the narrative, and things that the narrator is telling details, and there's no indication that this is meant to be symbolic, and you're just supposed to figure that out by sort of trying to look into the author's mind, as you might more easily do in a work of fiction. That does not, however, mean that I'm saying that it is logically impossible that something should be both factual and symbolic, but I do think there's something of a tension. All right, so today, to talk about a fudge factor, and what I mean by a fudge factor, it's a form of ad hocness, an ad hoc aspect to the theory. I'm going to just dive right in to the content, because this is best understood by examples, and these are both going to be real examples. So I'm going to start with the fudge factor of claiming that there are 7-ish signs in the Gospel of John. For this purpose, I'm going to use an actual conversation that I had with someone, but I'm not going to name the person because it was a personal conversation. But it's just such a perfect example of what I mean by a fudge factor, even coming from someone that I respect in some other respects, that it's just too good not to use because it was such an open use of a fudge factor. Now, the theory I'm talking about here is by no means a priori one of the most far-fetched symbolic theories that you will find, though in relation to the evidence, it does end up being far-fetched after the evidence is taken into account, because the evidence doesn't, in my view, support it. But a priori, it's just the theory that the author of John tried to structure his gospel around 7 signs because of something sort of cool about the number 7. It doesn't even have to be a theory that it was something super specific like the 7 gifts of the Spirit. It could just be, 7's the perfect number, or 7 gets used a lot in the Bible. Hey, cool, since I'm going to narrate only a few things at length, I'll make it 7 because 7's a cool number. So part of what makes it a priori not such a far-fetched theory is that it doesn't need to be asserting some kind of really specific symbolic meaning that the author expected his audience to get, but just that they would notice, hey, it's 7 signs. Now, what is far-fetched, and I actually think the person I was talking to would agree with me on this, and he was not advocating this, is that there is some now lost source that we don't even have, called the Book of Signs, or that scholars call the Book of Signs, that was, anonymous, and that the author or some editor of John was using this source, and we don't know who wrote it. That's all additional, and that I would say is just right from the outset far-fetched, has a low prior probability. But this would just be the theory that the actual author of John, it could be John, tried to structure his gospel around 7 signs. All right, but once you start looking at the evidence, and this is what I was saying in my conversation several years ago, it doesn't hold up. The theory doesn't hold up. Even just some kind of general, hey, cool, I'll structure my book around 7 signs, and people will notice that's the perfect number, because there are too many. The author narrates 7 miracles of Jesus. So I'm not even counting the places where the author says he did many signs but doesn't narrate specific ones. I think that's relevant, because if he's trying to count why confuse matters by throwing in these references to sort of bulk signs that Jesus does. But even aside from that, okay, he narrates 7 miracles prior to Jesus' death. But then there's Jesus' resurrection, which is explicitly said to be a sign in the Gospel of John. I mean, if we're going to talk about, John focusing on signs, they ask Jesus for a sign of his authority to cleanse the temple, and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So, right away, it's like, boing, the resurrection is a sign. Or the author says, after Jesus shows himself to Thomas, to doubting Thomas, many other signs did Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe. Okay, so his manifesting himself clearly to his disciples is being treated as a sign, and then it's saying that there were many others. But when you count that, now we have 8, all right, 8 that are narrated, got too many. And then if, as I think, and I suspect the person I was talking to probably thinks this too, John 21 was written by the same author and intended by him to be part of the book, even if it's kind of appendix. You have the great catch of fish there, so now we're up to 9. So I pointed this out. I'm like, and he doesn't, John doesn't count them. John doesn't say, he only says first sign, second sign for 2 of them, and then he doesn't go on counting. He doesn't say, this is the 3rd sign I'm narrating, or the 3rd sign I'm writing, or something like that. This is the 4th sign I'm writing. There's nothing like that. And even the 2nd sign, as Bart Ehrman conveniently forgets when he's trying to create a contradiction claim, it's qualified. This is the 2nd sign that Jesus did when he came out of Judea into Galilee. So it's not even, the 2nd sign that he did. Okay, so for all these reasons, it just doesn't stack up. It looks like it's a false view, because there's no objective way to count and have it come up as 7. And the person I was talking to said, well, the way I look at that is it's 7-ish signs. It's approximately 7 signs. Now, to me, this is a real head smacker, and I was sort of gobsmacked, and I, disagreed with him. It was a very cordial conversation, but think about what that is saying. What that is saying is that John wanted to emphasize the number 7 by signs, miracles of Jesus as signs that he wanted to include, but he got carried away and included 9, including the resurrection, which he explicitly calls a sign, and then was like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I'm still organizing my book around 7 signs because it's 7-ish signs. What are we to picture John's readers or hearers doing to discern this? If they're counting all of the narrated miracles at all, I'm not sure that they would necessarily do that, but if they're counting them and they count up to 9, are they supposed to say to themselves, 9 is sort of somehow close to 7. 9 counts as 7-ish. He actually said to me, 7-ish signs. So, wow, what a coincidence. I bet John, the beloved disciple, was trying to point to the number 7 because he thought the number 7 was cool by narrating 9. It makes no sense. 7-ish is nothing. If you're going to make a big deal about some number and say, wow, it's too much for coincidence, it's exactly this number, then you need to stick to exactly that number, especially when it's something like 7. The whole point is 7 is the perfect number. 9 isn't the perfect number. And so now we put some kind of a ad hoc margin around the perfect number, and 9 counts as falling in the bullseye zone because it's 7-ish. That is what I mean by a fudge factor. It's very ad hoc, and it's making it too easy to claim that these theories are justified when they're clearly not justified because you're fudging. Okay, here's another example. This one's published, so I'm going to name the author. I'd never heard of him before. Someone sent me this a copy of this article. Someone who actually knows the author personally. The author is named Seth Postel, and it's in an article's in an anthology, and I believe the title is Jesus Not as Moses in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, if you look this article up, I mean, I just told you the word not is in the title. Don't be confused by the words not, because as I'm going to quote in a minute, Postel actually is explicitly saying that Matthew wanted to draw an analogy between Jesus and Moses. He just also says that it was sort of a compare-contrast thing, and that there were also contrasts with Moses. So I'm not misrepresenting him, misunderstanding him. He is saying that Matthew is actually structuring his whole gospel around this attempt to make comparisons and contrasts between Jesus and Moses, and to see an analogy between Jesus and Moses. So there are a lot of things I disagree with in the article. Let me also add that the person who directed my attention to the article says that Postel believes that these things really happened. And I'm not denying that. So once again, I'm not saying any scholar who says this automatically thinks they didn't happen. Though if you happen to know that it's a mainstream scholar, critical scholar, that's a pretty fair bet. But apparently not in this case. But I still think the theory's wrong. So let me go to just one, and it's a place where a fudge factor is especially evident. Postel draws attention to the conclusions of the 5 discourses in Matthew and says that these conclusions are intended to draw an analogy between Jesus and Moses, and more specifically, between Jesus' Torah instruction and the Torah of Moses. As in Matthew, there are 5 references in the Pentateuch wherein Moses finishes a work or a discourse. Put that in your mind, a work or a discourse. And then he gives the references. I'll be going over those. 3 of the 5 references, 3 of the 5, in Matthew's Gospel, and he gives the references, are nearly identical to Deuteronomy 31:1 in the LXX. That's the Septuagint. So we've got a work or a discourse. 3 of the 5 are nearly identical to Deuteronomy 31:1. All right. Now, I'm going to be emphasizing the work or a discourse. So, but I also want to talk about Deuteronomy 31:1. So let me quote Deuteronomy 31:1 from a back translation into English from the Septuagint Greek. And Moses finished speaking all these words to all the children of Israel. All right. So it's just saying Moses finished speaking some words, a set of words to the children of Israel. I mean, that if you want to say that Moses finished saying some words, it's just saying that Moses is finishing some words. That's it. All right. Now, here are the 5 places in Matthew. Each of these is a closing bracket to a sermon discourse given by Jesus. All right. End of the Sermon on the Mount. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So Postel gives this chart, and he bolds and emphasizes finished and teaching. All right. Matthew 11:1 is the closing bracket of the commissioning of the 12. When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the city. So he finished, and he was instructing some words. Okay. Matthew 13:53 to 54. This is the end bracket, closing bracket to a discourse composed of parables. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works?" All right. Matthew 19:1 and 2 closes off a set of teachings to his disciples about their interactions among themselves in the ecclesia, the congregation or the church. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Jesus said some sayings. All right. And then finally, the close off of the Olivet discourse. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, and he predicts his death. Okay. Now, what are we making a big deal about here? This, what did he call it? Remarkable? Nearly identical. Well, these aren't even nearly identical to each other, much less to Deuteronomy 31:1. So just things like Jesus finished these teachings, just like, Moses finished speaking all these words. Jesus finished these sayings, and Jesus taught the people. We're emphasizing finished, some sayings or teachings or words, and sometimes he goes on and teaches somewhere else in addition. This is not remarkable, okay? Matthew wanted to tell you that Jesus finished a set of sayings or a set of teachings. What's important about this in the Gospel of Matthew, which I've discussed elsewhere in other videos on what I've called the composite discourse theory, is that it's evidence against the composite discourse theory. And I'm getting that from D.A. Carson, that when it explicitly says, when Jesus finished all these teachings, or when Jesus had finished all these words, or when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he went and did this other thing, it's indicating that this is not a chronological in terms of what Matthew's grouping together, that Matthew really is asserting that he said these things on this occasion, rather than that he's gathering together things that were in reality said on a variety of occasions. But that doesn't make them remarkably similar to Deuteronomy 31:1. If you're just going to say, Moses finished teaching the people some stuff, and Jesus finished teaching the people some stuff, that's all it is. Presumably they both sometimes finished teaching people stuff on a particular occasion. Nothing deeply specialized about the language here. There's not some, Greek code here that says, I'm using this word for teaching and finished, which is only used to refer to Moses. It's nothing like that. And for that matter, in Deuteronomy 31, Moses isn't really finished because he keeps on talking. It just refers to what has gone before. That's why some translators from the Hebrew don't even translate it as finished. It's something like Moses was saying these things. But the translation from the Septuagint does appear to be, finished. But in point of fact, he then goes on, for several more verses. So there's really nothing. There's no there. There's nothing remarkable here. But it kind of gets worse. Not only does Postel appear to think there's some kind of remarkable resemblance to one of these places in Deuteronomy. Remember, it's supposed to be significant that there are 5 discourse endings in Matthew and also 5 endings, finishings of Moses in the Pentateuch. But here's the fudge factor. In order to get that, he has to include things that aren't even discourses at all, okay? Because you just got to find 5 places where Moses finishes stuff, okay? And he can't get 5 if he just sticks to it, saying that he finished, a discourse, like Jesus finished, like a speech to the people, or a set of teachings from God that he was passing on. He has to combine unlike things in the life of Moses, even to get it up to 5. So let's go over these 5 places in the Pentateuch. All right, Exodus 40 verses 32 to 33. When they went into the tent of meeting, and when they approached the altar, they washed as the Lord commanded Moses, and he erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar, and set up the screen of the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work. So this is work on the tabernacle. Work on, finishing the making, the manufacturing that he's been the project manager for, and the tabernacle. Nothing about finishing these words or these teachings. And Postel is including this, okay? To get his 5. Number 7, 1 through 2. On the day when Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle and had anointed and consecrated it with all its furnishings and had anointed and consecrated the altar with all its utensils, the chiefs of Israel, etc., heads of the houses, approached. All right, so he's finishing and setting it up, and he's anointing it and consecrating it. So it's this sort of ceremony of consecrating the completed tabernacle. Finished setting up the tabernacle and anointed and consecrated it. It's not even finishing a set of teachings or a discourse. Somewhere Moses finished something. All right. I already read Deuteronomy 31:1. That's number 3. Then he lists Deuteronomy 31:24 through 26. When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. So, he's finishing writing something. It's not even just the words that have come immediately before in the document, as in Matthew, Jesus teaches a discourse, and it's like when he had finished these teachings or when he had finished these sayings, he went over somewhere else and did something else. This is a reference to apparently the much larger book of the law. Okay, and then finally, Deuteronomy 32, 44 to 46, Moses came and recited all the words of this song. So it's been this poetry, okay, that's come before. In the hearing of the people, he and Joshua the son of Nun. And when Moses had finished speaking all these words to all Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words by which I am warning you today. So this at least has something to do with words, but it's a song. So we have one place where Moses has just finished reciting a poetic song, one place where it's talking about him writing all the words of the law, the book of the law, one place where he's passed on some of the Lord's teachings, words to the people, and 2 places that have absolutely nothing to do with finishing teaching or words at all, but are about finishing a work on the tabernacle or finishing, setting up the tabernacle and consecrating it, completing a physical project. Now that's a blatant fudge factor. In fact, it reminds me of the scene in Fiddler on the Roof where there's a guy who's always trying to announce things, and he's always saying that things are found in the good book, and Rev Tevye will question him, and he gives a saying, some proverb about a chicken that's not found anywhere in the Bible. And as the good book says, and Rev Tevye says, where does the good book say that? And he said, well, somewhere it says something about a chicken. That's what it is. Somewhere it says something about finishing. Now that is a fudge factory. That's making it much too easy and then making a big deal about something that is obviously not a big deal because you've gerrymandered it by just trying to find every place where it says Moses finished something to come up with 5. Okay. So there is no there. Now, this concept of a fudge factor, it's pretty easy to see in cases of a number, where you're making a big deal about the number 7 or the number 5 and saying that the author apparently intended this number as an allusion or a comparison to something else. And then when the number isn't coming out the way you want it to, you add or subtract and say, well, close enough to try to make it come out that way. There is a cousin of this fudging that goes on in a somewhat different direction that I wanted to mention as I close up this series. This has to do with over-evaluating similarities among events that are really just generally similar, and then despising the idea that these are 2 different events of the same general kind. And of course, we see this very strongly in the case of the 2 temple cleansings. When enough scholars just say with great confidence, oh, it's so artificial to harmonize this by saying Jesus did it twice. There is no need to use such an artificial harmonization. it becomes a kind of urban legend. It becomes a meme. It takes on a life of its own that laymen don't feel they can push back against. I recently had a dialogue with someone on social media, someone I'd never been in contact with, and about the temple cleansings, and he pretty much indicated that he's just heard over and over again that it's terribly strained to think that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. And so then he was like claiming that the burden of proof was on the person who thinks Jesus did cleanse the temple twice, as if it's, the prima facie case is that he did it only once and one of the authors has moved it. And and he asked, well, what's the evidence in the text that Jesus did it twice? And I said, well, just to start with, the evidence in the text that he did it twice is that John makes it very clear that it's going on at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and Mark makes it very clear that it's going on at the end of Jesus' ministry. The prima facie case is that these are two different events. The burden of proof is on the person who wants to say that it's the same event and that John moved it. You've got your burden of proof backwards. And I pointed that out to him, but that wasn't enough for him. And the way that he spoke, it was pretty clear. Well, I've just always heard that it's strange to consider them to be two events. And what's the indication? And I said, well, there are a lot of differences, even beyond the different timings. They're not uncannily similar. And I linked for him an article by New Testament scholar Alan Chappell. Craig Blomberg has pointed out the same thing. There are, numerous small differences. It's almost like a kind of anti-harmonization. It's like a strained attempt to say that they're very similar. And you take all these little prima facie differences. Like, for example, Jesus has a dialogue with some religious leaders in the sort of vicinity afterwards, and they're sort of challenging him for what he's done. But in John, they say, show us a sign of your authority, and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's his response to their challenge to him. In the Synoptics, they come to him, I think it's the next day, and say, by what authority do you do these things? And so we can kind of take it that they're including the cleansing of the temple. And this is the famous dialogue where he says, was the baptism of John the Baptist from man or from heaven? And they like, oh, what are we going to say? It's this very brilliant turning the tables thing. Sorry, no pun intended, but verbally putting them on the spot. And they said, we cannot tell. And he said, then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And that dialogue isn't in John. And conversely, the destroy this temple thing isn't in the Synoptics, though there is an undesigned coincidence with Jesus' trial in the Synoptics. I'll try to stop my digression from getting too long by not giving that undesigned coincidence here. But the point is, you go over all these various differences, like you've made my father's house a den of thieves, and then in the other place you've made my father's house a house of merchandise. And it's almost as though the critical scholars are harmonizing these in order to disharmonize. They're like, those aren't so different. It just does look like the same event. It does. We're stomping our feet. We're ignoring the differences of wordings. And then we're saying, aha, now that we've seen that these are uncannily similar, no, they're not uncannily similar. You just kind of pretended that they're really, really similar. Well, now we've got this blatant thing here that they're said at different times and just can't harmonize that one, so John must have moved it. You see how that goes? Instead of seeing that the similarities are more general, as the nature of the protest that Jesus was carrying out, the symbolic type of actions he was carrying out in cleansing the temple, but are not itty-bitty little details that would be very, very improbable to happen more than once. But this person I was talking with, it was like I had to take him by the hand and show him that, because he had heard over and over again that it's just crazy to think of it as two temple cleansings, when he could have just opened up his Bible and seen the differences. it was like everything was being put into this realm that couldn't be examined by the layman. Okay? And that's not good. Don't do that. Okay? But this relates to the fudge factor because you're being almost mesmerized by being told these things are really, really similar. And it just couldn't be coincidental similarity between two generally similar events. That can't be. It has to be the same event that's been moved. Like saying, oh, well, John's obviously structuring his gospel around 7 signs. Actually, there are 9. Well, 7-ish. Are you saying that's a coincidence? Yeah, especially since it's not really 7, Well, Matthew is pointing to an analogy between Jesus and Moses by having 5 discourses, and there are these 5 completions in Moses. Well, yeah, but that's like including his finishing some project on the tabernacle as well as his finishing, some set of words. And it's just finishing stuff anyway. So finishing teachings even it's just kind of a general thing that Moses could do and Jesus could do. So it's not uncannily similar. Oh, are you saying it's coincidence? Yes, I'm saying it's a coincidence. And it's not really far-fetched at all. So I encourage you to question these theories, and especially when something is unstated and you're being told this is so cool. It's this deep underlying symbolism that this person is putting in here. He's doing this subtle thing. Right away, a little alarm bell should go off in your mind to say that's a pretty heavy theory. That's going to require the satisfaction of a pretty strong burden of proof. And then open up the text, engage your common sense, and ask yourself whether that's really been satisfied. That's what we're trying to teach here. And I am finishing these words of this series at the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.